I never thought betrayal would arrive wrapped in laughter. If you'd asked me years ago when I first slipped into my wedding dress and whispered yes with trembling joy, I would have sworn that my life was headed towards safety, stability, maybe even happiness. I was 29 then, a woman who still believed that love could carry the weight of everything. Now, years later, I can tell you the truth. Love can blind you, trap you, and silence you if you let it. And silence was the thing that nearly killed me, long before divorce papers appeared at a Christmas dinner. I can still hear his best friend's voice as clearly as if it happened yesterday. I was in the hallway that day, holding a tray of drinks, smiling politely as family filled the living room with chatter. My feet froze when I heard Nate chuckle, his words sharp as broken glass. "Do you think she'll cry when she reads them?" He didn't know I was there. He thought I was just another predictable woman, fragile, soft, easy to shatter. Brandon's reply came quickly, smug and careless. "She'll crumble. Women always do." My breath halted. My pulse roared in my ears like a storm breaking through walls. I remember staring at the tray in my hands, the wine glasses rattling against each other as though they too trembled from the cruelty of his voice. That was 5 days before Christmas. But the truth, my unraveling had started long before they wagered on my tears. It began in smaller ways, almost invisible, almost laughable if you didn't know what to look for. It began with his jokes. Brandon liked to perform. At dinner parties, at barbecues, even at casual Sunday brunches, he'd wrap an arm around me. His smile bright, his voice charming, and he'd say things that felt like paper cuts disguised as humor. "You know I could leave you tomorrow, right?" He'd joke, rubbing my shoulder like it was affection. The guests would chuckle and I would laugh too, because what else could I do? But every time those words brushed against my ears, something inside me shriveled, knotted tighter, became smaller. They thought it was light-hearted banter. They never saw the way those words lingered long after the laughter faded. People didn't notice how often his comments came, how easily they slid into conversations like poison diluted in wine. They didn't see how I stopped wearing my favorite red dress after he scoffed. "Trying too hard, aren't we?" They didn't notice how I checked his tone before I spoke, desperate not to trigger another joke at my expense. And because he never raised his voice, never lifted a hand, people thought he was kind. But his cruelty was sharper than fists. His words were blades dipped in honey. "Don't embarrass me in front of my boss. You're lucky I'm still here. What else would you do without me?" I learned to smile through it. At first I defended him. I told my best friend Jenny, "He's just sarcastic, he doesn't mean it like that." But she saw it even before I did. "He doesn't have to mean it," she said. "You look like you're disappearing." And maybe I was. I missed calls from my sister, skipped book club, deleted my social media posts. My life shrank until it fit inside the shape of his moods. The breaking point didn't come with screaming, it came with champagne. We were at a fundraiser, both tipsy, when Brandon turned to me with alcohol-glazed eyes and muttered, "You're just like the rest of them, always clinging, always needy." My mouth went dry. I didn't ask what triggered it. By then, I'd stopped asking questions. When we got home, he slammed the door, poured himself another drink, and collapsed into the couch. I tried to smile, tried to soothe, and then, in the softest voice, I asked, "Maybe we should sign something, just in case. You always joke about leaving. Why not make it official?" He laughed, careless and cruel. "You think I need a prenup to protect my fantasy football winnings?" Then he scribbled his name on a napkin and tossed it aside. He passed out, forgetting it by morning. But I didn't. I had that napkin notarized within 24 hours. Jenny stood beside me, silent, steady, handing me a pen. She didn't ask why. She didn't need to. We both knew. That napkin became my first act of resistance, my first step away from the cage he'd built around me. I folded it, slid it into a fireproof envelope, and hid it beneath a pile of tax receipts. I also emailed a copy to the private account Jenny had once created for me just in case. That night I cooked dinner as usual. I laughed at his jokes, cleared the dishes, and tucked the napkin's secret close to my heart. He thought I was soft, breakable. He thought I would crumble. He wasn't wrong, I had been, but something inside me had shifted. I had found a seed of steel. Over the next months, I kept records. I bought a cheap spiral notebook, nothing fancy, and hid it under the mattress. In it, I wrote his words, his late nights, the receipts I found in his jeans, expensive hotel's room service for 2 strawberries, dipped in chocolate on Valentine's Day, when he claimed he was out of town for work. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Each page of that notebook was a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't crazy, that the gaslighting wasn't working. And then came the nightmare. I woke one night to his voice in my dreams, sneering, "You'll have nothing." I sat up, sweating, heart pounding, and whispered to myself, "That's not true anymore." Because it wasn't. I had the napkin, the evidence, the journal. I had patience, and patience is power. From then on, I stopped being his wife. I became his shadow, smiling, serving, listening, watching, preparing. Jenny once told me as she looked over the notarized document, "He gave you the knife. You're just deciding when to use it." And she was right. But revenge wasn't the word I carried in my heart. What I wanted wasn't destruction. It was safety. It was freedom. It was the right to breathe again without checking if my breath annoyed him. I became the perfect wife in his eyes, all while sharpening my silence into a blade. I laughed when he joked about my overspending. I toasted him at company parties, even though I knew his promotion was a demotion in disguise. I complimented his cologne, even though it smelled like the woman he was seeing on the side. He thought I was softening. What he didn't see was that I was hardening. The more he believed I was small, the bolder he became. He left his phone unlocked, receipts in plain sight, messages flashing from numbers saved without names. I copied everything, forwarded screenshots to the email Jenny had created labeled files by date. I turned into a quiet archivist of my own marriage, a spy in my own home. But I wasn't planning revenge, not yet. I was building a parachute, because when you live in a house made of cracks, you don't wait for it to collapse. You learn where to step and when to jump. The final confirmation came just 2 weeks before Christmas. Brandon had been drinking, his phone slipping from his hand as he fell asleep on the couch. A message appeared from his mistress. "She doesn't suspect a thing. I'll file on Christmas. Want front row seats?" A laughing emoji followed, a gif of a woman crying into tissues. I read it twice, then screenshot it, then deleted it. My hands didn't shake, my stomach didn't churn. Instead, I thought of candles and turkey and garlands, of Christmas lights reflecting in wine glasses. He thought my breakdown would be a party trick. But he forgot something critical. When you hand someone a knife, you don't get to act surprised when they learn how to wield it. That was the moment I chose the date, the performance, the witnesses. If he wanted Christmas to be my undoing, I would make it my resurrection. Christmas dinner gleamed like a photograph from a lifestyle magazine. Garlands strung along the windows, candles flickering in glass holders, a roast turkey glistening beneath Brandon's carving knife. I'd polished the silverware until I could see my reflection in every spoon. To everyone else, I looked like the devoted wife who had poured her heart into creating a perfect holiday. Inside, my heart beat like a drum, counting down to midnight. It was strange standing there in the living room smiling as I passed spiced wine and refilled glasses, knowing that I was playing a role in the most dangerous play of my life. My sister Beth chattered happily beside me, cheeks pink from mulled wine, completely unaware of the storm brewing beneath the surface. Brandon's parents laughed about retirement plans, his best friend Nate stumbled with a tipsy grin, and all around me people lived inside the illusion that tonight was just another family gathering. But my legs trembled beneath the long folds of my dress. Not with fear, no, not anymore, but with anticipation, like a violin string pulled so tight it might snap with the lightest touch. Every time Brandon's eyes met mine across the room, I forced myself to hold his gaze with warmth. He winked once while slicing the turkey the way he always did when he thought he had me exactly where he wanted me. 8 Christmases together. 8 holidays where I'd smoothed over his barbs with laughter, where I'd swallowed shame like bitter wine, where I'd watched my own reflection fade from the mirror. But tonight was different. Tonight I wasn't soft. I wasn't breakable. Tonight I carried every piece of evidence, every cruel word, every scar he'd carved into me wrapped like a gift inside the folds of my resolve. When his father raised a toast to 8 more Christmases, I smiled politely, my lips barely moving. Brandon added, smug as ever, or however many we last. The laughter that rippled around the table sounded distant like echoes from another lifetime. I pressed my napkin into my lap, hiding the way my fingers curled into fists. The room quieted only when Nate leaned over and whispered something into Brandon's ear. His smirk widened his eyes, flashing that cruel confidence I had memorized. He tapped his glass with a butter knife, standing tall in front of the table. "All right," he said, his voice carrying just enough false sweetness to sound performative before dessert. "I have a little something for my lovely wife." For a fleeting second, Beth's face lit up. She thought he was about to hand me a necklace or maybe a handwritten letter folded inside a Christmas card. The guests turned to watch, expectant smiles spreading across their faces. And then he pulled the envelope from his blazer pocket, plain white. No ribbon, no card, just a hollow promise of cruelty disguised as a gift. I already knew what was inside, but I let my face remain calm as I lifted it unhurried and slid my finger beneath the flap. The hush that fell over the room was almost reverent. I unfolded the paper, slowly scanning the first line. Petition for dissolution of marriage. Already signed. Already filed. Highlighted sections marked with the pride of a man showing off his work like a schoolboy eager for applause. Brandon smiled at me, wide and triumphant. He was waiting for my tears, waiting for me to crumble, waiting for the bet he'd made with Nate to be won. Instead, I smiled back, a small, sweet curve of my lips that sent a ripple of unease through his smugness. "Thank you," I said softly. A flicker crossed his face, confusion, disbelief, a shadow of something he didn't recognize. Nate shifted in his seat, his smirk faltering. Brandon leaned forward, his voice too casual. "That's it." "That's it," I echoed, sliding the envelope back across the table. My hand didn't tremble. My heart beat steady, almost serene. Then, without hesitation, I reached beneath the table and lifted a gold-wrapped box, placing it between his plate and his pride. His eyebrows furrowed. "What's this?" "Your real gift," I said. The silence in the room was suffocating. He tore at the wrapping, the gold paper shredding under his fingers. When the leather folder appeared, his face didn't change at first. Not until he opened it. Not until his eyes scanned the first line and recognition dawned like a blow to the gut. The color drained from his cheeks. His lips moved silently, as if trying to rewrite the words with sheer will. Dated, notarized, reinforced. A prenup he had signed in arrogance, believing it meaningless, now staring back at him like a weapon forged from his own carelessness. "What is this?" Nate whispered, leaning over. "It's the agreement Brandon signed nearly a year ago," I answered calmly, my voice steady as stone. "Updated, reinforced, filed before yours ever touched a clerk's desk, binding under your own terms." He blinked, dazed, as if the room tilted beneath him. "But I filed first." "Which makes mine stronger," I replied with a smile so faint it cut sharper than any sneer. The silence that followed was thicker than the cranberry sauce congealing in its bowl. His parents sat stiffly. Beth's hand slid beneath the table to brush mine in solidarity, and Nate, his accomplice in cruelty, shifted uncomfortably, his smirk shattered. But I wasn't finished. Slowly, deliberately, I reached into my purse and pulled out one more envelope. Smaller. Thinner. I placed it in front of him like the final move of a chess game already won. His hand trembled as he opened it. Inside, a single sonogram photo rested against the paper. "I'm pregnant," I said, my voice even. 8 weeks today. For a moment, a crack appeared in his mask. A smile twitched at the corner of his mouth, involuntary, almost hopeful. But it withered as quickly as it came. His mind caught up to his pride. Prenup, assets, custody, the illusion of control slipping like sand through his fingers. "You planned this," he whispered, horror bleeding into every syllable. I met his eyes unflinching. "No, I prepared." The fire crackled behind us, logs splitting softly. The ornaments on the tree flickered in the candlelight. And Brandon, once so smug, so certain, sat frozen, clutching the edges of a document he had signed himself, staring at the sonogram like it was an omen. The silence that filled the room wasn't peaceful. It was sharp, electric, alive with the weight of truth. For the first time in years, I didn't feel small. I didn't feel breakable. I felt steady. And as I lifted my glass of wine to my lips, the sweetness of cinnamon clinging to my mouth, I thought, this is what freedom tastes like. Brandon's fingers clutched the folder as if gripping it tightly enough could change what it said. His jaw twitched, his lips forming words that never reached air. For once, the man who always had a comeback, always had a cruel remark laced with laughter, sat in silence. Across the table, his mother's pearls trembled against her throat as she shifted in her chair, her face pale. His father removed his glasses, though they weren't smudged, wiping them with the edge of his napkin, just to keep his hands busy. Beth's husband stared down at his plate, shifting uncomfortably. Nate, the man who'd wagered on my tears, scratched the back of his neck, his smirk long gone. The room was suffocating with silence. It was the kind of silence that doesn't soothe but crushes. The kind that swells with realization and shame until you can feel it pressing against your skin. I let it linger. I let it build. Every second that passed was another crack in the image Brandon had so carefully constructed. Finally, he looked at me. His voice was hoarse, almost foreign. "You don't have to do this." I raised my glass of wine, my hand steady, my eyes unflinching. "I'm not doing anything," I said softly. "You already did." A ripple moved through the table. I could see it in their eyes, the slow dawning that this wasn't an impulsive strike, but a quiet, patient storm, years in the making. Brandon leaned back in his chair, running a hand through his hair, the way he did when he realized he'd lost control. I had seen that gesture before in small battles. He fought with his boss, with creditors, with anyone he thought he could manipulate. But this time there was no one left to blame. His phone buzzed on the table, the vibration loud against the wood. He picked it up with shaky hands. I already knew what it was. Jenny had promised to send the confirmation at that exact moment. His thumb scrolled, his face paling as he read line after line. By the time he reached the bottom of the email, complete with Jenny's signature and firm's letterhead, his skin looked almost gray. He muttered something under his breath, something desperate, clinging. This can't be binding." Another buzz. His father's phone lit up. A forwarded copy of the same email. His father's lips pressed into a line as he glanced at Brandon, disappointment etched in his features. The golden boy, the pride of their family, had signed his own downfall with the arrogance of a drunk man holding a pen. I turned toward Beth, my voice gentle, almost casual. "I could use something sweet now. Could you pass the pie?" She blinked, then caught herself and nodded. "Which one?" "Apple. With whipped cream, please." She sliced into the pie, her hands only slightly trembling, while I retrieved a clean plate from the counter. The motions felt surreal in their normalcy, pie, whipped cream, holiday rituals. But beneath it all was the seismic shift of power, a tectonic plate of silence breaking free beneath the surface of our family. When I sat back down, Brandon stared at me as though I'd become a stranger. Maybe I had. Maybe I'd been hiding in plain sight for so long that he'd forgotten who I could be without fear. His lips parted. "You think you've won?" I didn't reply. I didn't need to. He wasn't worth the words. I simply took a bite of pie, the cinnamon warm, the crust buttery, the taste of peace so sharp it almost hurt. The scrape of his chair against the floor jolted the room. He stood abruptly, his voice breaking. "This isn't over." I set my fork down and looked at him, calm as the flames dancing in the fireplace behind me. "It is," I said simply. He stormed out the front door, slamming like a final punctuation mark. He left behind the prenup, the sonogram, the remains of his pride, all scattered across the dining table like broken ornaments. For a few seconds, no one moved. No one breathed. And then Beth exhaled sharply beside me. "I always hated that sweater," she muttered. A nervous laugh rippled through the room. "Rachel!" My cousin let out a shaky giggle. Even Brandon's mother gave a faint chuckle behind her napkin, though her eyes were glossy with disbelief. I smiled faintly and leaned into Beth. "Merry Christmas," I whispered. That night, after the guests had left and the dishes sat piled in the sink, Beth stayed. She refused to let me sleep alone. We curled up in the guest room, me on my side with one hand resting over the small swell of my belly. She reached out, brushing her hand against mine, a wordless solidarity that said everything I couldn't. I hadn't realized how long I'd been holding my breath until that night, when I finally let it out. By morning, Brandon was gone. No note, no call, just silence. His keys were missing from the hook, but the coffee pot sat cold and untouched. For the first time in years, I made myself breakfast without bracing for his footsteps, without measuring the sound of my fork against the plate. By 9 a.m., I was on the phone with a locksmith. "Emergency or standard change?" he asked. "Standard," I replied, then paused. "But make it fast." He came that afternoon, a quiet man with kind eyes who didn't ask questions when I handed him Brandon's keys and said, "Make sure none of these work anymore." When he left, I stood in the foyer, a new key in my hand, the metal warm against my palm. It was small, ordinary, but it was mine. The first thing I had owned alone in years. That evening, I stripped the master bedroom of everything that smelled like him. The cologne lingering on the sheets, the ties draped across the dresser, the old leather belt coiled in the closet. I opened the windows wide, letting the December air sweep through, cold and bracing like a baptism. I lit 3 sandalwood candles, candles I had once loved, but stopped burning because he said they gave him headaches. Their warm scent filled the room as if reclaiming it inch by inch. The next day the mail arrived. Envelopes stamped with red warnings. "Final notice, immediate action required." I stacked them neatly on a side table near the door. I didn't forward them, I didn't call, I didn't warn. That evening Jenny called, her voice bubbling through the receiver. "You won't believe this. Brandon's lawyer called. His face must have been priceless when he realized what you'd been sitting on." I smiled into the phone, curling into a blanket on the couch. "Is it official?" "He lost 70% overnight," she replied. "And with a baby on the way." She paused, savoring the words. "He's going to be cutting a check so big he'll need a payment plan." I laughed softly, not for the money, not even for the victory, but because for the first time in years I could sit in my own living room without bracing for war. Jenny's voice softened. "I'm proud of you." That nearly broke me. "Thanks," I whispered, my throat tight. "For staying, for everything." "You've always been strong," she said. "You just finally let yourself believe it." Her words echoed in me long after we hung up. The fallout was quiet at first. Friends chose sides. Some sent cautious texts, laced with disclaimers. "I'm not taking sides, but..." Others unfollowed me altogether. Yet others were bold, sending messages of admiration. One from a woman I hadn't spoken to in years simply read, "I wish I had your strength." A bouquet of peonies arrived at my door a few days later. No card, just a note. About time. Brandon's assistant, Claire, of course. She knew, she always knew. Meanwhile, Brandon began to unravel. His swagger vanished. The jokes stopped. Word spread through his office, through his friends, through the world he had built on laughter at my expense. The man who once bragged about training wives like interns was suddenly the punchline. And me. I began to breathe again. I bought lavender soap. I painted the nursery soft sage green. I folded laundry while humming songs I hadn't sung in years. At night, I lit candles and drank tea in silent silence that no longer frightened me but embraced me. The first time I felt the baby kick, I was barefoot in the kitchen slicing peaches for a pie. The flutter caught me off guard, delicate as butterfly wings brushing from within. I dropped the knife, both hands flying to my stomach. Tears filled my eyes, but not from sorrow, from joy, from life. For the first time, I whispered to myself, "I'm not alone." I started measuring time in small mercies instead of hours. The way morning light pooled in the kitchen sink, clean and quiet, without his mug clanging or his sigh dropping like an anchor into my chest. The way the house sounded at noon, radiators humming, a distant dog barking, my breath steady, without the static of his moods crackling through the walls. I found relief in ordinary things that used to feel like mine before I traded them for the performance of being a good wife. Lavender soap on my wrists, slippers that made soft sighs against the hallway floor, a sunbeam that warmed the nursery wall and made the paint look almost alive. I had forgotten that a home could hold you and not press you down. Beth came over most afternoons with Tupperware and family gossip and the kind of laughter that slid around my shoulders like a shawl. She didn't ask about court dates unless I wanted to talk. Mostly, she filled the house with stories about her toddler's new obsession with lining up toy cars, or her failed attempt to bake croissants, or how she cut her bangs and accidentally invented a new geometry of regret. When she caught me staring at the window too long, she would nudge my elbow and say, "Out of your head. Drink your tea while it's hot." She knew that my worst habit was rehearsing every possible conversation with a man who had already left the room. The locksmith's new key clicked with a sound I grew to love. It was like a soft oath, a promise renewed each time I turned it. I started keeping the old keys in a ceramic bowl by the door, a small altar to what no longer worked. When envelopes arrived addressed to him stamped in red, I stacked them neatly on the side table and learned not to touch them. "Not my problem," I'd murmur like a spell to keep the past from crawling back under the door. Jenny checked in at least twice a week. Sometimes she brought contracts and questions, and sometimes she brought hydrangeas and scones and the kind of silence that isn't empty but safe. On one visit, she dropped a manila folder on the coffee table and grinned wicked and proud. "He's officially out of places to hide," she said. "Also, would you consider naming your daughter after me? Jennifer with a Y is underutilized." I snorted tea through my nose, and she applauded like I'd won an award. That was the thing about her, she made breathing feel like a triumph again. On a rainy Tuesday, my cousin Elena arrived with 2 suitcases, a grocery bag of snacks, and a promise not to let me nest myself into a hermit cave. She moved into the guest room as if she'd always lived there, leaving a trail of fuzzy socks and half-read paperbacks, like breadcrumbs from a brighter forest. She worked from the kitchen table with her laptop and a headset, muting herself whenever she had to chase a crumb of croissant across the spacebar. When I woke from a nap to find her doing yoga in the living room with a video on low volume, she waved me over and insisted I try a prenatal stretch for humans who recently fought dragons. We both fell over on the second pose and howled with laughter. That night, the baby fluttered like a moth under my ribs, and I took it as agreement. The nursery became my confessional. I painted one wall a soft sage that looked gray in the morning and green at dusk like it couldn't decide between bruise and meadow. I sanded a thrift store dresser until the wood showed its old stories. I lined a shelf with children's books, some from our childhoods, some brand new spines bright as candy in a dentist's dream. Even the rocking chair, which arrived in 1,000 hostile pieces, eventually surrendered to Elena's patience and my bribes of lemon bars. When we finished and set it by the window, we sat down and rocked in silence, letting the hinge sing a small, hopeful hymn. I found old wedding photos in a cedar-lined box in the hall closet. The ribbon crackled like it remembered being tied by someone who didn't know they were wrapping a beginning to an ending. I sat on the living room floor and flipped through the images, my smile too bright, his hand too possessive at the small of my back, the two of us framed by blooms that cost as much as a month's rent. The faces were strangers. I didn't cry. I slid each photo into a separate envelope and wrote one word on the box in tidy black ink: release. Then I drove it to a donation center and left it there with an easy goodbye. Driving home, the sky had that late afternoon color that makes you think briefly that everything is possible. Some afternoons I walked slowly through the neighborhood, one hand curved under my belly like a question mark. I learned the names of the dogs who tugged their owners past my fence, the mail carrier who tucked packages on the porch, and whistled the barista who began to recognize the sound of my steps. Once, while crossing the street, I saw Brandon on the sidewalk outside, a bank phone to his ear, face tight with the kind of frustration that used to send me scurrying toward apology. He didn't see me. Or maybe he did and scrolled past. I kept walking. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt untethered from him, as if the string that used to knot us together had frayed and finally fallen away. Later, Jenny texted a screenshot that his firm had removed his name from the quarterly newsletter. I wrote back a single thumbs up and then put my phone face down, choosing the rhythm of my kettle over the rhythm of his consequences. Grief didn't leave me entirely. It came in small eddies, a song we once danced to playing in a grocery aisle, a hand-shaped shadow on the bedroom wall at dusk, the reflex to rehearse my sentences for a man who was no longer there to correct them. But grief changed costumes. It no longer arrived as a storm, but as a drizzle I could step through. On the worst days, I wrote to the baby. I told her about the world I was rebuilding, the soup recipes I was relearning, the way the maple by the front porch had a bark like a road map. You'll never have to tiptoe through this house, I promised on a page that smelled faintly of glue and laundry soap. You'll never confuse fear for love. I underlined the last line twice. There was a morning when the radiator clicked, the humidifier purred, and the first kick startled me into laughter. I set down the knife, a peach surrendered half-sliced, and pressed both palms to my skin. "Hello," I whispered, as if I'd been waiting my whole life for this private knock. Tears came quick and good. I had forgotten what it felt like to cry without shame. Elena started a ritual she called Proof of Life every Friday. We'd lay everything from the week on the dining table, a list of meals we cooked, a nap taken in the afternoon, an appointment kept, a book finished, a laugh that left our ribs sore, and then we'd toast with ginger ale and declare it all sufficient. If anyone asks what we accomplished, she'd say, "Clinking my glass, we'll hand them this moment and call it a day." The baby shower put together by Beth and Jenny felt like a chorus, stitched from women who had loved me in different eras and in different ways. The living room was a riot of paper flowers and laughter. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon and citrus, and everywhere I turned, someone was holding my hand just briefly, just long enough to say, "I'm here," without making it a speech. When I opened the soft blanket Jenny had crocheted during depots and late-night filings, she shrugged like it was no big deal and then wiped her eyes. "Blame the yarn dust," she muttered, and everyone pretended to believe her. Sometimes messages from distant friends still arrived with disclaimers, caution shaped like kindness. I learned to read past the hedges and hear the tiny bell of truth I wanted to speak. I wanted to say, "I'm proud of you." I wanted to be brave, too. And sometimes bravery was a bouquet left without a name, like the peonies that appeared on my stoop with a note. About time. I put them on the mantel beside the crib's tiny socks and felt the room lean toward the future. The legal machinery ground on like a factory at night, loud in its own world distant from mine. Papers were signed, numbers were calculated, dates were set or postponed. Jenny stood between me and the noise, translating only what I needed to know. "It's going our way," she'd say, and I would nod and return my gaze to the small universe forming under my ribs. There were nights when sleep came like a slide into warm water, and nights when it stayed away stubborn as a cat just beyond the porch light. When I couldn't rest, I'd rise and pad through the dark house, visiting each room as if it were an old friend returned. The kitchen with its easy hum, the living room where the couch had grooves shaped like survival, the nursery a hush of soft colors and half-read stories. I'd sit in the rocking chair and imagine the weight of her against my chest, our breaths echoing, the house settling around us like a hug. Outside, the maples scraped a quiet rhythm against the siding. Inside, I counted the seconds between the baby's rolls and hiccups, and let my body trust that morning would come. On a blue-edged evening, Beth came by with her son. He toddled into the nursery and pointed at the string lights. "Stars," he said solemnly, like he was naming a secret. Then he dropped mashed potatoes on the floor and grinned at his own audacity. I lay on the rug and laughed until my belly jumped. "We're not delicate," I told the ceiling softly. "We're alive." When the first snow came, I stood by the window and watched flakes drift past the porch light, each one catching and letting go. The baby pressed an elbow against my side as if to say, "Me too," and I rested my hand there in answer. I thought about the last Christmas and the next one. I thought about garlands and carols, and the sound of plates being set for people who had earned their seats. I thought about the woman at the head of the table who would slice the pie with steady hands and speak gently, and lock the door because it was hers to lock. I thought about how the story's music had changed, how the percussion of dread had been replaced by the violin of relief, how the chorus was not revenge, but the simple, stubborn hymn of a peaceful life. Brandon's shadow didn't vanish, but it thinned. Sometimes I caught it slanting across a memory, and I stepped around it. Sometimes it lay quiet in a corner, and I didn't bother to sweep. The opposite of love wasn't hate, I learned. It was spaciousness. It was a house that didn't tilt with anyone's mood. It was the exact temperature of tea you prefer because you made it for yourself. The night before my due date, the house was a held breath. Elena had taped a checklist to the fridge with a marker that squeaked when it wrote, and Beth had left a overnight bag by the door with a bossy note, snack or revolt. I took a bath that smelled like oranges and clean cotton, then slid into bed with a book I didn't finish. Moonlight made a pale ladder up the bedroom wall. Somewhere in the late hours a contraction tugged, insistent, not unkind. I placed my hand on my belly and smiled. "Okay," I whispered. "We're ready." The truth is, I had been getting ready for a long time, not just for labor, but for the labor of building a life that fit us both. I had been strengthening muscles that don't show up in photographs, the ones that hold your boundaries, the ones that lift your voice, the ones that carry you out of a house that confuses fear with love and into a home that does not. Sometime before dawn, I dozed in the rocking chair and dreamed of teaching my daughter how to spot the difference between an apology and a performance, between a joke and a small cruelty, between a promise and a cage. I dreamed of her feet thudding down the hall, the joyous racket of a child who trusts the floor. I dreamed of cinnamon in the air and 3 sandalwood candles flickering on the dresser, their light making halos on the paint little proofs of life stamped on the wall. When the next contraction came, I breathed through it and counted. Elena appeared in the doorway, hair wild, eyes bright. "Proof of life," she whispered. I nodded, laughing, and she laughed too, and the sound moved through the house like wind through chimes. We stood there for a moment, 2 women holding up the roof with our bare, ordinary joy, while the world outside our window kept on spinning in quiet, obliging circles. Labor is not just physical, it is the soul insisting on a new beginning. The night contractions began. I walked slowly through the house, touching the corners of each room as though blessing them with my steps. The nursery hummed with readiness, the soft sage walls glowing faintly in lamplight. Elena packed the last of my things with brisk efficiency, but her eyes lingered on me with quiet fear disguised as determination. Beth rushed in 20 minutes later, hair damp from the shower, cheeks flushed, insisting she would drive, even though she nearly dropped her keys twice from shaking hands. In the hospital, the hours blurred into waves of pain and pauses of breath. But even there, even while gripping the rails of the bed with sweat-drenched palms, I felt a kind of strength that had nothing to do with muscle. It was the strength of surviving years of silence, of preparing quietly, of holding my dignity in secret until the world was ready to see it. I thought of Brandon somewhere in his hollow apartment, maybe pouring whiskey into a glass, maybe staring at a wall. The thought passed over me like a shadow, but it didn't linger. His chapter in me was over. When they placed her in my arms, tiny, pink, furious with life, I wept. Not from fear, not from loss, but from an overwhelming flood of belonging. She blinked at me with eyes that mirrored pieces of him. But everything else, her cheeks, her small fists, the stubborn set of her mouth felt like mine. She rooted against me, fragile and determined, and I whispered, "You'll never doubt you are wanted. Not for a single moment." Those first weeks were chaos and quiet miracles stitched together. Nights blurred into feedings and lullabies sung off-key. Days softened with the smell of baby powder laundry folded into impossibly small piles, sunlight pooling around us like blessing. Elena hovered, cooking enough food to feed an army. Beth slipped in and out with toddler giggles and quick hugs. Jenny dropped by with contracts tucked beneath diaper packs, refusing to let me forget that victories were still being sealed in offices far away. One afternoon, rocking her to sleep, I realized I was humming again. Not the anxious, broken tunes I used to sing to fill the void between his words, but real melodies, ones my mother sang when braiding my hair, ones I had forgotten lived inside me. She stirred, eyelids fluttering, and I pressed a kiss to her temple. It felt like a promise: music will never be a weapon here, only a comfort. The house itself changed with us. I painted the kitchen cabinets pale cream, bought curtains patterned with tiny yellow stars, and planted herbs in chipped ceramic pots on the windowsill. At night, I walked barefoot through hallways that no longer held the echo of dread. Even silence had softened, no longer taut as a wire, but full, warm, generous. The legal conclusion arrived like snow, quiet, inevitable. Jenny called one morning while I cradled my daughter against my chest. "It's final," she said. "You're free." I laughed, startled by the sound, and it woke the baby. Her wail rose fierce and clear, and Jenny chuckled. "She agrees." Free! The word rolled around in my mouth like a foreign fruit, sweet and startling. I was free not just from him, but from the cage of pretending. Free from the careful smiles, the edited sentences, the long rehearsals for a man who never listened. And yet revenge was never the end. Freedom was. Peace was. I no longer needed him to crumble in order to rise. His downfall was just a footnote. My daughter's first laugh was the headline. The following Christmas, the house glowed with garlands again, but this time not curated to impress, not polished into sterile perfection. The tree leaned slightly, its branches heavy with mismatched ornaments, some gifted, some thrifted, some handmade. The dining table was smaller, cozier, draped in a simple cloth with mismatched plates and bowls filled with food, cooked with love instead of performance. Beth sat at one end, her toddler dropping mashed potatoes on the floor with delight. Elena poured wine, laughing too loud, wiping her hands on her jeans. Jenny sat with her new partner, their fingers intertwined. And in the high chair between us sat my daughter, babbling nonsense with an authority that made us all laugh. She smacked her spoon on the tray like she was conducting an orchestra only she could hear. I watched them. The women who had held me up, the baby who had remade me. The room glowing not with chandeliers, but with ordinary joy, and I felt full in a way I didn't know possible. After dinner, when the others drifted to the kitchen for dessert, I curled into the armchair by the fire, my daughter asleep against my chest. Her breaths warmed the fabric of my sweater, her tiny fingers clutching at me even in dreams. I whispered softly into her hair. He once said I'd be nothing without him. I kissed her temple, tasting salt and warmth, and everything holy. Turns out I'm everything without him. The fire popped softly. Snow pressed against the window, blanketing the world in quiet forgiveness. I closed my eyes, cradling the weight of my new beginning, and exhaled. If this story of strength, quiet preparation, and the power of reclaiming your voice touched you, I invite you to stay with me. Like this video if you believe no woman should ever feel powerless in her own home. Share it with someone who needs reminding that silence can turn into strategy. Subscribe for more stories where betrayal meets justice, where despair transforms into resilience. And please tell me in the comments what moment stayed with you most. Was it the gold-wrapped box on Christmas, the prenup hidden in plain sight, or the baby's first cry that proved I had already won? Because every voice matters, yours too.